Hello, good people. I'm sitting in for Don Edwards in Every Church a Peace Church, and we are most fortunate that again this week we can have with us a continuing dialogue with Jim Wallis. Is that every Church of Peace Church has been concerned about this book, God's Politics. And we have a chance to continue the dialogue from the week before, as a good part of this book is not only on the politics per se, but on the necessary issue that brings it forth for our time, and that is the war in Iraq, and our talk of a new kind of world control. And we speak of it as the American Empire, which some people say is already here anyway. We are just now revealing to the world that we have been doing it anyway. Is that, and we have a chance to continue. And we want to talk about this war and the possibilities of it, both for Christians to use for a higher purpose than what the war was started, and for alternative means of dealing with it, with how do we even think about ending it. In fact, that's really where I'd like to start with the ending of it, is that because when we really think what happened, we moved away from the UN, which had been set up as ways of control, right? So that any nation that tried to start a war in the world would be met with the combined forces of the countries. We stepped out beyond that because we couldn't wait for 2 or 3 weeks, at least it was at one time. But can we say that there are any political enforcements that speak to and in line with our theological imperatives?
Well, you know, in the Christian tradition, there's really only 3 ways of dealing with war, with peace and war. One is the crusade idea, which has fallen out of favor, gratefully. It's coming back, though, in some circles.
Yeah, that's the point.
Coming back. Or there's the nonviolence of Jesus, to take Jesus seriously at the point of loving our enemies, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they are called the children of God. Or the tradition of just war, which from Augustine, Aquinas, and most denominations hold that just war tradition. But then there are rigorous criteria.
In fact, I think you'll have to explain just war, because a goodly number of the public might hear just war.
Just war. Just war. Well, there's a criteria that says a war is just or unjust by these criteria about what happens to civilians, and whether there's. You talked about the international nature of going, well, this was a preemptive unilateral war, so the authority was not taken by all the nations, but by by a coalition, they say, but it was really a unilateral war with the U.S. and British mostly, you know, it's supposed to in fact not create more problems than it solves, and it's supposed to be a war of last resort, and this war was clearly not a war of last resort, and now we know that the major reason, the argument for going to war, these weapons of mass destruction, were not there.
That's right.
And the president acts like it doesn't matter if they weren't there. This was the main reason for going to war. So this is why around the world, churches said this was not a just war. Now we're there. Now what do we do? And I think many have called for the internationalizing of this, which I, of course, support. We should have done this in the first place. But as long as the U.S. won't give up control of the agenda and the future, won't say things like, we disavow any interest in permanent military bases in Iraq, which we've not said.
In fact, we're setting them up.
We certainly are long-term military bases for presence. Or that we want to disavow any financial interests in the oil in Iraq.
That's right.
If we were willing to give up control, then I think the international community would come in. But as long as this is an American operation, an American mission that we are in control of, other nations won't come in. So you mentioned empire before. I have a statement in the book by a number of theologians, about 200, mostly evangelical theologians, who say they're disturbed by what they call, number one, a theology of war.
Yes.
Emanating from the highest circles of power in America. Two, a language of righteous empire, more and more invoked these days. And three, a sense of divine mission and calling for a nation and a president in a war on terrorism. And they remind us, the theologians, that Christ knows no national boundaries here. And that Jesus' words are, in fact, we either believe Jesus or we don't. If we believe him, then what do his words mean about blessed are the peacemakers and loving our enemies? These are the hard sayings of Jesus, but we either believe them or we stop naming his name.
In fact, one of the people we've had on this program talked about this nonviolent Jesus and these nonviolent ways, and this is what we can get used to, right? Is that
Exactly.
and when we think in terms of it, right, is how do we find an alternative? What is the alternative for it? For instance, what has bothered me is that Martin King is, to me, the prophet of our time. Martin made it very clear that violence creates more problems than it solves, right? And it continues to create problems. And we've always known about this cycle, continuous cycle of violence, right? That leaves a residue in every nation that's involved, so that they have continuing heightened violence, and then leads back into war itself.
Yeah.
All right, and Martin defined peace he defined it as the presence of things, right? The presence of love and truth in that beloved community that we talked about last week, right? And not about the absence of things. Is it how long? How can we create? What are the kind of alternatives, the ways of thinking
that
we don't have to go back through this whole thing again from the Roman Empire of might and power,
That's the right question.
through to the just peace, through to the
there are those who say, well, it's always good to have around some Christian pacifists like C.T. Vivian and Jim Wallis, but they're not very practical, and they can't really protect us very well because we live in a real world, and nonviolence doesn't work very well. Well, I want to say, where is war working very well?
Thank you,
War
Jim.
is not working to solve these problems.
Yes.
Saddam Hussein was a problem, was a threat. Was bombing the children of Baghdad the best way to deal with him? We have to, I think, do more than protest. We've got to, protest is good, but alternatives, as you just said, are better. What is our alternative? Now, movements of nonviolence in recent decades have been very effective in overturning tyranny. Ending oppression, causing violence to cease. We've got lots of examples. I talk about many in the book about bringing down dictators without killing people.
That's right.
So nonviolence, I think, has to answer the questions that violence purports to answer, but in a better way. Nonviolence isn't just sort of a nice idealistic thing. As you've shown, people like you, it's a practical way of solving problems, resolving conflicts, ending oppression, and in fact achieving justice and peace. And so before the war in Iraq, a number of us met with Tony Blair and tried to persuade him to go a different direction, and we weren't successful, but he at least met with us.
But he had a million people in the streets, didn't
That's
he?
right. That's right. But, we put forward this plan, 6-point plan, the book talks about this, how to, in fact, disarm whatever weapons Saddam had, how to indeed remove him from power, but without war. War is not the answer here. And we put this forward, and it's being considered in the British Parliament, at the UN, even our own State Department asked us to come and present this plan. I think it came too late, but it showed me that we have to have a clear alternative. And I think, we have to show now that War isn't, if we're going to subject violence to these tough tests, is it working? Why subject war to those same those tests? Preemptive unilateral war is a bad foreign policy.
Right.
It's not working to accomplish the goals most of us believe in.
Yes, in fact, you see, the old definition I remember in Poli Psych 1, right, 101, was that war was the extension of foreign policy. Is that, and the thing about that for me was it caused me to really think about not ending war, but changing foreign policy. In other words, that you said it in another way just a moment ago, except it was just sort of off, seemingly off, but it was really on target. And we have to think about is that we started too late. And it seems as though that one of the real purposes of the Christian church, right, is to start early, to have this third political position, all right, that is already there working for peace.
To not just say no, but here's a better way.
That's exactly right. That would be the way to put it. In fact, as Paul says, a better way, right? Now, when we think that way, the Christian church can become really the force that it ought to be in the politic of the world, right? But as long as we don't, and as long as we see it as you say, a nice idea, an idealistic approach, we will miss the things that have always been done in the name of the Christ that has worked.
I think it's time to take that kind of leadership role, proactive role. At the G8 meetings coming up in a few weeks, we're going to have a church leaders summit, first one ever, at Lambeth Palace, co-hosted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, to push these Millennium Development Goals, these goals that have been agreed to by 147 nations, to cut extreme poverty by half in 15 years. Now, this is directly related to our security. I got a chance to say to President Bush once at a meeting on another topic when he was talking about terrorism, I said, unless we drain the swamp of injustice in which these mosquitoes of terrorism breed, we're never going to overcome terrorism. We have to go deeper to the resentments and the anger and the frustrations and the grievances which lead to conflict and violence. And so just having a military response is just like sitting around the swamp of injustice with shotguns and trying to pick off the mosquitoes when they rise up from the swamp. It doesn't work. And more mosquitoes, more shotguns, more military spending. It doesn't work. So I'm not just saying that I'm morally opposed. I'm saying it's not working.
Yes.
You show me how your policy's working, and I'll listen. I'm saying your policy isn't working.
Thank you, Jim. When just as you're talking, I could not help but think about the fact that a part of our problem is we have never asked forgiveness for the sins we've committed in the world. So the people that we have harmed all over the world, right? Cannot help but have resentment. If the same thing happened to us, we would resent it too as Americans, and we would be fighting back against their control of our land, right? Is that colonialism comes to my mind as the great sin, the great structured sin, all right? The great structured evil of our time that is there. We don't know. You can go all the way through college, grade school to college in our country, and never learn about colonialism. I've tried it on college groups, right? Is it, what is colonialism? They do not know. Some of them even talk about, well, that was when we had American colonies. I mean, they have no idea, right? So how can they understand the world? And since we will not bring these things up, we can't ask forgiveness of it. But, and that bothers me.
And 90% of the Muslim countries in the world today have lived most of these last few hundred years under colonialism.
Yes.
And that's why they're angry.
That's it.
That's why they're angry. If most Americans, if they saw what happens to Palestinians every day at Israeli checkpoints in the West Bank and Gaza, they saw every day, they would think it was wrong. They also think bombing suicide bombers in Tel Aviv is wrong, and it is. But what's happening every day at those checkpoints to ordinary Palestinians, all the Palestinians, most Americans say that's wrong, but we never see it. We never hear about it. People don't hate Americans. They hate some American policies that Americans often don't know anything about, don't even know what we're doing around the world. So it's time to be responsible citizens and take responsibility for what we're doing around the world and say, is this policy working, or do we need a whole different foreign policy?
Yeah, and when we see that the wars and the support of wars and the support of dictators who create the wars, right, are a part of our foreign policy, the extension of our foreign policy, then we can begin to examine our foreign policy. I have a feeling that there's very few Christians, very few people in this nation, regardless of their faith, that do any examination of our foreign policy until there's a war. And then we're told that we have to be patriotic, and so we have to back it.
And most people around the world would welcome American leadership at the point of ending the nuclear threat, global warming, overcoming global poverty. What they don't want is American dominance. American leadership for good things the world would welcome, but American domination is a very different thing. One of the head of state before the war in Iraq told me off the record one day, so I can't say who it was, but he said, you know, most of us are just waiting to see if America will ever listen to us, or if we just have to keep listening to America.
In fact, I think you bring up something that has been part of me for the last 20 years, really, is that, in fact, since movement, so we're talking about 40-some years now, right, is that the thing is that I think the world is looking for leadership, and they cannot deal with a leadership that does not admit its mistakes, that will not try to help them with their real problems. We set up the World Bank, but the World Bank won't give to people what they need, but what we demand that they do. And what we demand only fits into our concept, does not fit into their needs, right? On every hand, I can't help but think the fact that I remember one time way back when, right, when the Earth's crust was cooling, as my son says, is that there was an essay that talked about that Hitler could have bought all the land that he had taken by war and then was unable to keep because of war, right? But he could have had it all with the money he spent on war, gaining them, right? And wouldn't have had to destroy their nation or his in the process.
You know, there's a big story about closing these military bases, and they're going to save $40 billion a year. Well, we're spending $5 billion a month in Iraq. Right?
That's it.
And so there's no money. I was just in Tennessee. They're cutting Medicaid for 323,000 people. Because there's no money left. The money spent on that's right here. That's right here. It's happening in every state. So that's money spent on Iraq, which is not making us secure. My two boys, we live 20 blocks from the White House. They're not more secure because of Iraq. They're less secure.
That's right.
They're in more danger. We're spending all that money, and then we give tax cuts to the wealthy in a time of war. It's never happened before, and so there is no money left for anything else. So the poor are becoming the war casualties. They're victims of the war too, because they're now off the agenda. And all that's on the agenda is security, war, and tax cuts. So we end up with I saw a letter from some people in Appalachia. They said, please, it was an open letter to the president, please invade Appalachia. We have terrorists here. They're in the mountains. I think you could take them down quickly. Then you could rebuild Appalachia. Because we got to be rebuilt here. So I think you only rebuild places you go to war with, so we'd like you to make war in Appalachia.
Oh, boy.
They were making funny, but they were making a point. But they're just left out of the whole. I live in Washington, D.C. The local school doesn't teach, doesn't educate, local high school. Not only that, you could be shot on your way to class during the day.
That's right.
And we tolerate this.
That's right.
And we wouldn't tolerate it if they were white kids.
That's exactly right.
You know, we tolerate this. That's not our priority, yet we're talking about rebuilding schools in Iraq.
Yeah. You know, and that is the point again, is that the world needs a rebuilding. You see, I was just thinking about, as we were talking last week, is that Jesus put what we do to the poor on the front line of the litmus test of our faith. Yet the policies of our nation do exactly the opposite of Jesus, and we go to church and bow down, and look at this metal cross, which has no sacrifice in it, unless you place it there, and we don't understand the sacrifices that we should be making, and the policies that we should be following. Right, in terms of making certain that the poor, wherever they are in the world, that in their our doorstep, right, and we still give the money away to those that don't need it, which was not on Christ's agenda as the number one issue. The number one issue are the ones we're leaving out.
Jesus' two first priorities would have been the capital gains tax and the occupation of Iraq, don't you?
You know, or he wouldn't have been popular, you see.
Well, Jesus has become pro-rich, pro-war, and only pro-American. You know.
Boy, that's
so it's like our faith has been stolen, and it's time to take it back. We need a rescue operation. You know, Jesus' reputation is at stake here. You know?
He was also white and male, and so his reputation
is blonde really and blue-eyed. Right? You know, in the book I talk about the God question is always, how are the kids doing?
Yeah.
The war is going well, but how are the kids doing? Particularly those kids that are left out, left behind. That's always. God would say, yeah, but how are the kids doing? I said, well, you know, not so well. Not so well. That's always the God question.
That's good stuff. Is it, do you think, you know, we've had these plans, as you say, we have a plan now on poverty, right? 15 years what we could do if, right?
The Millennium Development Goals have been approved by all the 147 nations, including ours, and we're just paying no attention to it.
You know, see, this is what bothers me. Is that the world is waiting.
That's right.
And looking for soul, not military leadership, not political leadership. What they're looking for is spiritual leadership.
You know, I had a conversation with Gordon Brown, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Great Britain. He'll replace Tony Blair in a year or two as the new Prime Minister there. He said something that just has stayed with me for a long time. He said, for the first time in history, we have the knowledge, the resources, the information, and technology to substantially end extreme poverty as we know it. We couldn't have done this in the 19th century. We can do it now. What we lack, he said, is the moral and political will.
I knew he was going to say will.
And political will.
But he added to it the moral and political will.
Then he looks across the table and says, and that's your job in the faith community.
All right.
And he's right. Our job is to create the moral and the political will. Social movements are what change history. And you've shown that. I mean, you led that.
That's right. In fact, people's
and the best ones have a spiritual foundation.
That's it. In
it's
fact,
always
they
been
all
that way.
start with a spiritual foundation.
That's right.
It's whether they run into culture and change, as some the labor movement, for instance, started that way. And as one of the sociologists said, the problem with the ship of labor, it got stuck on a reef of mashed potatoes and gravy. Is that materialism has a way of changing, destroying great movements, great thought. It would be the hope, since these nations have already not only said that they want to end poverty, they have even talked about giving a percentage of their national national net profit. Right now, given that, is that United States is the only one and the richest that has not in fact given what they promised. How do we work to see that happens?
The American people, if you poll them, they think that we are the most generous nation in the world. They really think that, because they want to be, which is good.
Yeah.
But we're not. When you compare our aid with the Scandinavian countries or the Europeans, we're way, way down the list. Now, we give privately, too, which is a good thing. But the U.S. should lead the way. We're the richest nation. We're the superpower. We should lead the way, and we're not. So calling upon both parties, you know,
Yes.
to lead the way here is connected to our security,
Yes.
connected to our humanity, and, as we've been talking, connected to our faith.
Yes. And who can call upon both parties? It is the party of Christ. It is the politics of God, and regardless of our faith, right? It's the politics of God can do it. This is our role, isn't it? Like he said it. Kofi Annan had a world meeting of at the UN, fill the UN and clear out on the clear out doors, right? The moral and spiritual leaders, right?
Yeah.
And what to deal with is these problems.
Yeah.
As Kofi Annan said, it's very clear, is that we can't leave it up to politicians, right?
Yeah.
It's a moral and spiritual problem. That's what Martin King, the prophet of our time, was saying. It's a moral and spiritual problem, and we must solve it with moral and spiritual means. And as we've made clear, is that the means you use will determine the ends you get. We said it a lot differently, but that's it. Whatever means you use, that's the end you're going to get. There's no escape from it, right?
And people like you have showed us that this can be done. We've done it before, and we can do it again.
We can do it again.
Poverty is the new slavery.
All right.
And we have to fight
and we have to
spiritually.
Get rid of it. This has been another marvelous half hour. And I just want to thank you, Jim, right? Every
blessing.
Church of Peace
My
Church
blessing.
thanks you. And the Regional Council of Churches that brought you here is, we're in debt to it, that they had the spiritual foresight to bring you here and to share you with every Church of Peace Church. We're thankful for you, Jim,
It's my honor to be
and
here.
thankful for your book, God's Politics. Thank you for it, and we're thank you for all of it. And move around this nation and do preach in that calm, measured voice of yours about what's good for us all, meaning not Americans only, but for the world. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
All right? Okay.